Alright, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott coming at you with some JavaScript courtesy of Murox JavaScript 2nd edition. We are now just about through with our book. We have chapter 16 and 17 to go. Chapter 16 begins on page 517 and is entitled How to Work with JavaScript Object Notation, or JSON. Alright, so in this chapter we're introduced, and that's all this is an introduction to JSON. Now, a couple of things before we go on. Okay, the first is, if you go out to JSON.org, I believe it is, that is the site for JSON. It's functional, but not very pretty. Okay, so that's the first one. And I think there might be something, is there something down here for JavaScript? There it is. JSON, etc. So you can take a look there if you have an interest. Again, JSON.org. The other thing is, if you've never heard the acronym before, I'm going to go out to Wikipedia.org and I'm going to type in Ajax. All right. For years, Ajax was known as an acronym. And it stood for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. The reason I'm telling you that is over time, XML can be kind of boxy and hard to read, hard to understand. If you want a good introduction to XML and what it's about, it's an old article. But if you go out to xml.com, that's actually a site by O'Reilly Publishers. And if you go out there, I don't know why it's not letting me out there. It should. I don't think it's. There it is. There'll be a thing there with a bird on it and some other stuff. I've gone out here many times. And like I said, there we go. But if you go out to the what is XML, what you get is about a 17-page document on what XML is. And if you get a chance ever, you should read through it because XML is still used. It's just not nearly as popular as it used to be. In many ways, again, XML has been replaced with JSON, but they say this JSON is often used in the AJAJ. I'd never even heard of that before until I came out and saw this, which is asynchronous JavaScript in JSON. All right, so you can take a look at that, any of those, if you have a desire to do so. But I'm going to come through and start going through this chapter. So our objectives. Use the JSON. Remember, JSON is JavaScript object notation. So use the JSON object to serialize and deserialize data in applications. Customize what's called the stringify method and the parse method in applications. Explain what data serialization and deserialization are. Distinguish between binary and textual data formats. Describe the benefits of JSON as a data format. List the 6 allowed data types in JSON. Describe what the stringify and parse methods do. Describe how to customize the stringify method. Describe the order in which the stringify method serializes data. And describe how to customize the parse method. All right. So, just taken from the top then. An object is serialized when it's converted to a format that can be stored and transmitted, and deserialized when it's converted back. Where a lot of this stuff came from is when you start to talk to people who work on the hardware side of computers, and they talk about sending data across the wire, as they'll call it, or the internet. What they'll say is typically it's the old proverbial, you can't shove 10 pounds worth into a 5-pound bag. So a lot of times you've got something big that you want to send over the wire, but you can't send it directly. Instead, you have to break it down into smaller components. Again, typically when you talk about this hardware-wise, you put them into packets. You send the packets along the network, and then you have to put them back together again. All right? So when you serialize, you're breaking it down into packets or smaller pieces. When you're deserializing, you're putting it back together. I've given this example before, and you may find it helpful. Maybe you find it worse. I don't know. But years ago, there was a TV show on called Home Improvement with Tim Allen. And Tim had his own tool show. He was kind of a klutz, but he had 3 kids and a wife. In the last season, they decided they were going to not have the show anymore. It was still getting good ratings, to my knowledge, but they just decided that this would be the final season. So his Tim Allen's wife, Jill, ended up getting her master's degree in psychology. And she was offered a job. They lived in Michigan, and she was offered a job in Indiana. And Tim, trying to be the dutiful husband, and she'd given up so much for him over the years, decided that he was going to move with her. Okay? Well, long story short, they were cleaning out their house in Michigan, and Jill said to Tim, "Boy, I'm just going to miss this house so much. There's so many memories in it. It's too bad we can't take it with us." And then, of course, Tim, who was always up for the big idea, in the next scene, you saw him, and it looked like they had taken the house off of its foundation, and they were taking it on a trailer, and they were going to move it to Indianapolis with them. But imagine you couldn't do that, because that's not typically what you were going to do. Imagine the house was brick, and you decided that what you wanted to do is you want that house, but what you're going to do is you're going to take it apart brick by brick, and then later when you move it to its new location, you're going to put it back together brick by brick. Well, when you're taking it apart brick by brick, you're serializing. When you're putting it back together into one unit brick by brick, you're deserializing. Now, hopefully that helped. All right? You typically serialize a data structure to store it or to transmit it across some kind of a network location. Why? Because, again, typically before you can store data, it must be converted to a data format that the data store can use. All right? Here's some different common types of text formats. Now, one thing to notice is that the last 2 that are in there, meaning XML and JSON, XML again, another acronym for extensible markup language, JSON for JavaScript object notation, as we already talked about. Both of those are text files. All right? What that means is you can open them up in Notepad or any simple editor. If you've got a file that you cannot open up like that, okay, then it's a binary file. I don't know if you've ever tried doing this or not, but if I come in here and let's see, I've got a file here called Top 10 Developer Portfolios, and it's in Word, as you can see. But if I right mouse click on it and I choose Edit with Notepad++, it's going to look like garbage, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take a binary file and read it with an editor that's meant for text files. All right? On the other hand, if I come in here and do I have anything that's here, stuff.txt, I don't even know what that is. Oh, okay, but if I try taking that stuff.txt and I do an open with, and I try to open it with, I can open it with Notepad or Notepad++ or WordPad, but what I'm wondering is can I open that? Let's try to do that. So I'm just going to, I'm going to open up Word, and then I'm going to do a file open, and I'll have to search for it. It's on the desktop, and it's in there. And you'll notice it doesn't show that file in there. All right, but if I come down here and I choose all files, it will now show it. So let's see what we have in there. There, stuff.txt. Okay, notice I can open it up. It may look a little bit different, but the point of this is to let you know that I cannot open up a binary file with a text editor, although I can open up a text file with a binary editor. All right? Something to keep in mind. Or not. All right. So here's examples of data formats, and they talk, they show you here some serialization. So what are they doing there? They're taking the object to be serialized, all right, right there, and they're converting it to binary, converting it to CSV, which is a comma-separated variable file. That's how it would look in XML, but you'll notice that's how it looks in JSON. And many people like JSON because it looks very similar to the way that you would set up a serial object in JavaScript. Whereas XML is a little bit more boxy, klutzy, kind of harder to look at and harder to read. So JSON is more flexible than comma-separated variables. It's known as being lighter weight than XML. It's become the preferred data format over the years for JavaScript. Most web services provide data in both XML and JSON formats. JSON uses the object literal notation. So again, it's something that people are used to seeing. It can be read and understood by humans and computers. Again, more flexible, less verbose, easier to work with. Some of the rules. There's only 6 allowed data types that you can use in JSON. Strings, numbers, booleans, arrays, objects, and null. So undefined data type is not supported. Function definitions are not supported. Object instances aren't supported. All data types are represented as key value pairs, and the more you work in the computer area, the more you find that things work in key value pairs. Arrays are represented by brackets and objects by braces. So curly braces, in other words, for objects. And single quotes are not supported. So let's take a look at an object that's represented here as JSON. So we've got var employees equal. So really it's everything that's in between here and here. Again, one of the main reasons that it's easy to work with is it's a subset of JavaScript. It isn't a programming language. It's a data format that uses some of the JavaScript programming language features to store data. And because it is only a subset of JavaScript, not all of the JavaScript rules apply. Notice ECMA Script 5 provides a global JSON object that provides methods for converting objects to and from JSON strings, and we'll look at those in just a second. And older browsers that aren't ECMA Script 5 compliant can use the JSON shim for this purpose. So if you go out there, you find that. Basically, it's just a way to make sure that if you're using older browsers, it doesn't break. So, the methods of the JSON object. All modern browsers have a JSON object, and they all provide stringify, which serializes or breaks down, as we talked about, a JSON object by converting it into a JSON string, and then parse, which goes in the other direction. It deserializes the string and converts it back into an object. Again, if you want more, that's also shown in the book on page 523. Now, if you want to use the stringify method, there's the syntax in the middle of the slide there. And it requires 3 parameters. Object, which is the JSON object to be serialized to JSON. Some people call it JSON, some call it JSON. It doesn't really matter. Replacer, which is an optional function or array that controls how the object will be serialized. And space, which is an optional number or string that inserts white space. So the stringify method converts the JavaScript objects that's passed to it into a string. By default, it adds double quotes to the key names and converts single quotes to double quotes and converts date objects to strings that represent dates in universal time. If the method finds unsupported items like function definitions and or undefined values, it drops them. If they're an array, it converts them to null. If necessary, you can use those optional replacer and spacer parameters to customize how the object is going to be serialized, and we'll look at that in just a minute. But there are examples in here. And you can see where you're serializing a string and serializing an object, etc. Now, we already talked about the stringify, so let's look at the parse method, which is on pages 526 and 527 in the book. You see the syntax up at the top, and you can see from here that notice a JSON, it's a key word, so it's a constant, so it's all in caps there. And the parse method takes two parameters, text, which is the string to be deserialized, and receiver, which is an optional function that controls how the string is deserialized. If the string to parse isn't valid JSON, it'll throw a syntax error exception. If the string to parse has an array or an object with trailing commas at the end, it'll again throw a syntax error exception. So the parse method, its job is to convert a JSON object to a JavaScript object. But again, it doesn't convert date strings to date objects. And it does throw syntax exceptions and when I just told you. Right. And here are some examples. Again, these are shown on 527 in your textbook. All right, the next thing that's done is we go back to our old familiar task manager application. You've seen this in several chapters. I believe chapter 9 was the first one that it was in. All right, like previous versions we've looked at, this application gets task information from a user, it stores it in local storage, and it displays the tasks in a text area control. But this version also adds a date to each task and uses the JSON object to serialize and deserialize the task data. The date in here is the result of calling the date method's toDateString method. So when the date is serialized as a string with a date only rather than a string with a date and universal time. The JavaScript for this, HTML hasn't changed too much. You can see a little bit in here, but it's very superficial. All right, there's the JSON string in local storage. And here's the main JavaScript file. Again, you can see what's changed. Most of it here that's been changed is the stuff in yellow. The code creates an object literal for task data, calls the stringify method to store an array of objects as a string, and then calls the parse method to restore the string to an array of objects. All right, again, the serialize, deserialize. Now, the default behavior of the stringify method does a pretty good job of serializing data. It not only stores an object's data, but also information about the object structure so the object can be deserialized. Most of the time, that's all you need, but when you get into this enough, you might find that you want to customize the way the stringify method serializes data. You might want to omit something. For instance, you might have confidential information that you just don't want to serialize. So one way to customize the results of the stringify method is to add a toJSON method, as you see right here. In the first example, an object literal named obj is coded with three properties, first, last, and salary. Then the object is passed to stringify. As you can see, all three properties appear in the string. Okay. In the second example, a toJSON method is added. This concatenates the value of the last property with the value of the first and excludes the salary. right? In this last example, the toJSON method returns an object instead of a string. So you might want to use the toJSON method to combine two or more properties, to add to the serialization output, or to keep properties from appearing, as we just mentioned, because they're private or whatever. So you can override the default serialization of the stringify method by adding a toJSON method. If it exists on an object and contains a function definition, the value returned by the calling function is what the stringify method will serialize. All right, so again, it is not simple, but it is a way of customizing. So here they're talking about customizing the task manager application. So in this version, we use a constructor function to create a new task object with a toJSON method. This method converts the task object to a string that displays the due date and the task. It simplifies the display code because it no longer needs to use the map to reduce methods of the array of tasks returned by the parse method, and it no longer needs to create object literals to store the task data from the user. Again, the bottom line is what you're always looking for in here is how to take your code and simplify it. Now, that simplified is a relative term because when you first start doing this, it may seem that rather than simplifying it, you're making it more difficult. All right. Now, what we just looked at, we talked about how to use the toJSON method to customize the way stringify serializes an object. But what if you want to customize all objects? For example, what if you want to ensure that salary properties are never serialized or that strings are always capitalized? If that's the case, then you can use the replacer parameter. Of the stringify method. So the figure that you see here shows the syntax, which can be either a function or an array. If it's a function, it's called for every property or array element, and it returns the value to be serialized. If it's an array, the values in the array indicate which object property should be serialized. In other words, what a replacer does is it's a whitelister. It tells you what you want and what you don't want to serialize. So if the replacer parameter is a function, it's called on every object property or array element, and the value returned by that function is serialized. If it's an array, only the properties that match the array elements are serialized. Pretty much what I just mentioned to you. The JSON string returned by the stringify method has no white space by default. Sometimes that makes it difficult to read. So, the space parameter can be used. The space parameter accepts either a number or a string. If the space parameter is a number, the return value is indented with that number of white spaces, up to a limit of 10. If the space parameter is a string, the return value is indented with the characters in the string at each level, up to a limit of 10 characters. So spaces versus characters. The space parameter is the third parameter in the string method. So you must also pass something for the replacer parameter. If you don't have anything to pass, you can always pass null. So you use it to control how a JSON string looks, typically to make it easier to read. And I believe that they show some examples in here. Here you go. Here versus here, for example. That's the same information. All right. On pages 540 and 541, they talk about the serialization order of the stringify method. When you customize the way the stringify method serializes JavaScript, it's important to understand the order of its steps. Otherwise, your customization may go awry. In this first step that you see right here, stringify checks for a toJSON property whose value is a function definition. If it finds one, it invokes the function, passes it to the current item being serialized, and returns the value it gets back. If it doesn't find one, it applies the default serialization to the current item and returns the result. Step 2. The stringify method looks for a replacer parameter to apply to the value returned from the first step, which is either the result of the JSON method or the default serialization. In the third step, the value from the second step is serialized as necessary. All right. So when you look through here, here are some examples. So again, remember, when you invoke the stringify method, it looks for the toJSON method and the replacer and space parameters, and they have to be in that order. All right, not only can you customize stringify with the toJSON, but you can customize the parse method as well. Most of the time, again, the default behavior is all you need, but you may want to customize how the parse method deserializes data. For example, you may want to add a new property to the data, or you may want to convert all date strings to date objects. So the syntax is shown on the top here. Again, the parameter must be a function, and the function is called for every property or array element in the JSON that's being parsed. And you can see the order in which things work. Sometimes it just makes the most sense, again, to look at some examples. So this optional reviver parameter of the parse method is a function that's called on every object or array element to let you control the serialization. As we mentioned a little bit earlier, sometimes this can be problematic when you're working with date objects. So one of the most common uses of the reviver parameter is to convert JSON date strings to JavaScript date objects. And the reason that you want to do that is that then you are able to use, if it's a date object, you can use those date object methods that are available. JavaScript doesn't have a built-in way to check whether a string is a valid date. So you may need to combine different kinds of techniques. I think they even show you some ways in here. Maybe they don't. But you can use a date object constructor, regular expressions, the instance of operator, but they all have their own shortcomings. In other words, none of them are perfect. All right? So you notice in here, Chuck the Russell 2000, notice what it does. Party like it's 1999. All right, so even though these are not valid dates, this one and this one, they're not valid dates, they still convert to valid date objects. Again, these are the ways what we mentioned before. I'll just leave that up there for a second here. The very last thing that's done in the chapter, on the last 6 pages, I guess, of the chapter, is the author again enhances the task manager application. So far in the chapter, there have been 2 versions of the task manager application. The first one, this is just in chapter 16, displayed the due date and the format returned by the date object's toDateString method, and the second one used a custom toJSON method to format the due date. Both applications stored the date as a string, though, which means the application can't sort tasks by date, even though this would be a useful feature. So this chapter ends by presenting a third version of the task manager application. It uses replacer and reviver functions to customize the stringify and parse methods. It also converts the stored date strings to date objects so they can be sorted by date. So again, the application that you see on your screen here and on page 547 of the text is an enhanced version of the task manager application. Again, it uses the replacer parameter of the stringify method to capitalize the date task before storing it. It also uses the reviver parameter of the parse method to convert date strings to date objects when retrieving the date tasks from storage. This keeps most of your JavaScript code in here simple, while also adding the ability to sort tasks by date. In this library storage.js file, again, as you see, the reviver function converts date strings to date objects. The replacer function capitalizes strings. Both of these functions treat the main object that's being serialized or deserialized differently than the other objects. And then finally, we've got here the main JavaScript file. This uses the storage library functions to get, set, and clear tasks that are in local storage. But ideally, every time you see this, these are going to get smaller and smaller. And ideally, again, simpler and simpler to work with. So again, by no means am I an expert on JSON. By no means, if all you do is read the chapter and look at the examples, are you either. But you've been able to see how JSON can be used as a data format for transferring and storing data. You've gotten introduced to the stringify and parse methods, and you've seen several examples, all right, including 3 versions of this task manager program that will ideally help you to understand it in even more depth and breadth of coverage. So that's it for Chapter 16.